So some ANC members this afternoon are disputing the chairperson of the party's electoral committee, Kgalema Motlante's NEC nomination list, and have now filed a motion with the High Court in Johannesburg to try and compel the ANC to urgently release all the raw data from the nomination process. Earlier this month, the ANC released a list of 200 names, in fact, of members who will officially then be shortlisted through an election process down to 80 positions on the NEC. The group is from Sidibeng that's filed this issue with the courts, questioning how the list was compiled, and it's also demanding that the publishing of all branch nominations received for all candidates be made public. The unhappy members are also asking the courts to intervene and allow the issue to be discussed at conference. ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa will square off with Dr Zweli Mkhize for the party's top position at conference over this coming weekend. Ramaphosa is heading to Nasrec with the Phala Phala scandal hanging over his head, while Mkhize has a scandal of his own to do with the Digital Vibes contracts from his time as health minister. The ANC's Integrity Committee has already started issuing letters notifying members who've so far been disqualified because of criminal issues against them. Now, as for Ramaphosa and Zweli Mkhize, the reports against them will be brought up and discussed at the conference. Let's talk about the ANC's upcoming conference now with Professor Dirk Kotze, political analyst. Prof, a very good afternoon to you. Welcome to the show. So we're seeing now the first court challenge against the nomination process of the ANC. Should you think all the raw data be made available as to who was nominated by whom with how many numbers in the interest of transparency?
Well, I think the Commission, Electoral Commission has done it already with the top 6. And there are some statistics about the top 10 of the 200 that they have released earlier on. So if they've done that, I think then they've set a precedent for themselves about providing information in general. I think this is, given the fact that the decision-making about nominations is now much more in reflection on the number of nominations by the branches compared to the nominations in processes of previous national conferences, which were different. That really sort of now makes it incumbent on the Election Commission to provide this information, because that has become the basis of their decision-making processes.
The challenge for those challenging this process of the additional NEC members, the shortlisting thereof, which will then ultimately be narrowed down to 80 people upon election, is that they would need firstly for the court, would I be right, Prof, I know you and I aren't lawyers, to decide on this issue rather urgently because the conference is now just days away.
Yes, this is becoming an urgent matter, and I think they will have to have a conclusion about that and clarity about that actually before the conference starts, because if that becomes a bone of contention, it will make the decision-making and the voting process exceptionally difficult. And as we know, it is only a national conference that can elect the National Executive Committee. It cannot be done by, for example, National General Council or any other body within the ANC.
Something else, in fact, what we wanted to talk to you about originally before this news broke this afternoon, or this morning, in fact, was to do with the focus around the conference. We've spoken at length about the major personalities, the incumbent President Ramaphosa and the scandal around Phala Phala. His challenger, Zweli Mkhize, has his own headache with Digital Vibes. But not as much has been said, at least in the media or in the mainstream discussions about policy. Is that because we as the media have a fixation with personalities, or the ANC itself is fixated with names rather than issues and substance?
I think to some extent it's about both. You know, up to the Polokwane conference in 2007, there were very seldom any elections. For the top 6, for the National Executive Committee, there was more of elections. But for the top 6, there were, most of the time, it was unopposed. So it meant that it was not so much about election campaigns. There were actually no election campaigns. And it was a process within the ANC about succession planning and succession processes, and not so much about opening it up for persons to announce their own positions as candidates. Since 2007, we've seen it first also in the form of the development of so-called slates, at least two sets of candidates. This has now been, to some extent, been stopped with the Election Commission, and led by Kgalema Motlanthe, to try to prevent slates from developing. But what we've seen subsequent to, in the last at least 2 other national conferences, was very intense competition. And that immediately elevates the focus to that of individual candidates, and not so much what they believe in or what their program is, what do they stand for within the ANC or what they want to promote, but rather just who they are and how they position themselves in terms of factions or other types of groups within the ANC.
But
and as you indicated...
Please finish your point, sir. Thank you.
And as you've indicated, all the discussions about policy just took the back seat. And even at the National Policy Conference in the end, in July this year, there wasn't such firm decisions that could now just be presented to this conference. In 2017, we know that many of the important decisions were done in haste, in a very short space of time. But I don't think this conference is going to be different because the focus remains still very much on the election processes.
But how much then are the ideological views of a single candidate, even if they're running for president, for instance, how much are they important when you consider that ultimately the ANC prides itself in collective decision-making? So whether you agree or not, it's all about the numbers ultimately, which will guide the direction in which the party and perhaps even the country, if it continues beyond, as the governing party, beyond 2024.
Well, in theory, yes, it is about collective decision-making. It's also about what they refer to as democratic centralism, which means the decisions are ultimately taken at the top and binding on everyone to the bottom. But in the end, whether the principle of collective decision-making, which sounds very idealistic, is in the end not necessarily applied. It is about what is the position of the top 6 of the ANC, and very much what is the position of the president of the ANC. They are very important policy makers or persons who ultimately determine the opinions within the ANC. And it is not just an open process of decision-making where everyone has a sort of an equal input in the process of decision-making. Ultimately, once a position has been taken, and we've seen it now lately again, take, for example, the decision about how they will vote tomorrow in Parliament. Mm-hmm. That has come from the top 6 initially, and that has sort of evolved down to the parliamentary caucus now. And that means that it is collective in nature, but the origin is not necessarily the same collective as the collective who must implement it.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about then is for ordinary people who aren't card-carrying members of the ANC or even ANC voters in an election. Why should they care about what's going to happen from Friday through to early next week? Why does it matter for those who are asking themselves that question?
Well, I think for now, and we will see whether the election in 2024 might be different, but up to now, political parties determine their candidates, their members of parliament ultimately, who's going to stand as members of parliament or for the provincial legislatures or even for local government. So it's a party decision. And what we are going to see at this national conference is going to be who are the new national leaders of the ANC. First of all, the top 6, plus then the 80 in the National Executive Committee. They are the key decision makers in the ANC who ultimately decides what is going to be the direction of the ANC in terms of policy matters, as well as who are going to be the main persons representing the ANC in government, whether it's at who's going to be the president, who's going to be the members of the cabinet, as well as at provincial level, the premiers and the executive councils, as well as at local level. And I think this is why there's so much of a push now from the public side in order to say, but there must also be independent candidates. And we know that is in the pipeline in Parliament at the moment, in order to balance this very dominant position that the parties and the party leadership has taken up over time.
Professor Dirk Kotze, always a pleasure to speak to you, sir. Thank you.